Fellows, MMA is a sport that has more what-if scenarios than probably any other sport in the world. So today, I'm here to run you through the top 5 what-if scenarios in MMA and UFC history. At number 5, I have the retirement of Zabit Magomedsharipov. This guy was well on his way to a championship fight. He was 6-0 in the UFC. Almost all his fights were extremely dominant. He was a dynamic striker. He looked like Yair Rodriguez on the feet with some of his crazy kicks, but at the same time, his grappling, he's a Dagestani guy, was obviously top tier as well. Very few fighters in the history of the sport have passed the eye test more than Zabit Magomedsharipov. He was so clean on the feet, such a good grappler. I was so convinced that this guy was going to be destined to become a champion. It reminded me a lot of when guys like Ilia Topuria and Islam Makhachev were on the rise. You just knew. You saw how they fought, and you were like, this guy's going to be a champion one day. And I had the same feeling for Zabit. There was a lot of legitimate conversation going around in 2019 and 2020 that Zabit Magomedsharipov was going to be the guy to dethrone Max Holloway and or Alexander Volkanovski. This guy was that legit. But then out of absolutely nowhere, he didn't have any terrible injuries. He didn't have any scandals outside of the octagon. Zabit announced his retirement, and it shook the MMA world to its core. A lot of people, including myself, saw it as kind of a fraudulent retirement. I think most people just assumed he was going to come back. But to this point, he hasn't come back, and he hasn't fought since 2019. So I don't think Zabit is ever coming back, and that's truly a shame because he really could have been the champion at featherweight. If you are not super familiar with Zabit Magomedsharipov or haven't really watched his fights, please go back and watch some of his fights. He has some of the craziest highlights you will ever see. At number 4, I have one that's been talked about a lot. It's what if Conor McGregor never left MMA to go box Floyd Mayweather? This one's been well documented. Most people know about it. Conor McGregor was on top of the world. He just came off his double belt victory over Eddie Alvarez, where he looked like maybe the greatest MMA fighter of all time. That performance against Eddie Alvarez is still regarded as one of the greatest championship performances we have ever seen. But then Conor McGregor went to go sought after his money fight against Floyd Mayweather, and he got it, set him up financially for the rest of his life. But he really sent his MMA career downward in a spiral. Ever since the Floyd Mayweather fight, Conor McGregor just has clearly not been the same fighter. He lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov, he lost to Dustin Poirier twice, and he's only fought like 5 times since that fight, and it's been a lot of years at this point. And there have been a couple of reasons that people have tried to explain it. A lot of people say he fell in love with his hands and kind of lost that kicking karate stance. A lot of people also just say he fell in love with the money. It's tough to get out of bed with the silk sheets on. We all know that. When guys get the money, you don't want to train as hard. It makes sense. But regardless, whatever the reason is, we saw Conor McGregor go from one of the best looking fighters of all time against Eddie Alvarez to now having a losing record since that Floyd Mayweather fight. There are a lot of people who think if Conor McGregor stuck with MMA and did not take that Floyd Mayweather fight, that he could have gone down as a top 5 MMA fighter of all time, and it's a real shame we didn't get to see that. A whole chunk of his prime was taken out of his career. At number 3, we have Francis Ngannou leaving the UFC. Francis Ngannou was on top of the world. He was the heavyweight champion of the UFC and looked like one of the most dominant, scariest human beings of all time. There was a lot of conversation that this was the best heavyweight we had ever seen. When Francis Ngannou first went to go fight for the championship against Stipe Miocic, he was a knockout artist, probably had the most power we have ever seen in a UFC fighter, but he simply wasn't ready and he wasn't well-rounded. His grappling was nada, his cardio was inexistent, and Stipe completely outclassed him and schooled him. But then Francis Ngannou got in the lab, improved his skills. On the way back to the championship, he actually just knocked everyone out in like a minute or less, but when he got to fight Stipe Miocic, you could see the improvements. In round 1, he was calm, he was patient, he wasn't wild. He actually showed some good takedown defense and even takedowns himself against Stipe Miocic, which was crazy. Then in round 2, he knocked him out, brutal Francis Ngannou style like he always does, and we knew this guy was a problem. Then what was even scarier was his first title defense against Ciryl Gane, where he lost rounds 1 and 2, and everybody just assumed he was toast because Francis Ngannou's known not to have cardio, and Ciryl Gane was kind of piecing him up on the feet. But then Francis Ngannou shocked the world. He won rounds 3, 4, and 5, mostly due to his wrestling, which nobody saw coming. Francis Ngannou, the most dangerous striker and probably most powerful striker of all time, having grappling skills is probably the scariest thing in MMA history, and it is such a shame that that was his last fight in the UFC. We never got to see him fight Tom Aspinall. We never got to see him fight John Jones, and those are 2 all-time super fights that we were robbed of because Dana White was greedy. Or maybe it was Francis Ngannou asking for too much. We'll never really know, but the result is they could not come to agreement. Francis Ngannou signed with the PFL and went into boxing, and we probably will never see him in the UFC again, and that is such a shame. Coming in at number 2, I'm sure most of you saw this coming. It's the whole Tony Ferguson-Khabib saga, and in particular, Tony Ferguson tripping on the wire. The fact that Tony Ferguson had a 12-fight win streak in the best division in the UFC and never got an undisputed title shot is just mind-boggling. And this what if really comes down to two things. What if Tony Ferguson didn't trip on the wire, and what if Tony Ferguson didn't decide to cut weight twice and still fight Justin Gaethje on a rescheduled bout? Tony Ferguson was another one of those guys who looked like one of the greatest fighters of all time, but then took one bad beating against Justin Gaethje, and he was clearly never the same. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like I would have picked Tony Ferguson over Khabib Nurmagomedov, because I wouldn't. I would have picked Khabib to win the fight, but you're out of your mind if you think Tony didn't at least have a chance. And think about how much that would have altered and completely shattered the whole UFC timeline if Tony Ferguson was the undisputed champ and Khabib lost. Things would be very different nowadays. That's why Tony Ferguson not fighting Khabib comes in at number 2, biggest what-ifs in UFC history. And number 1 is more of a theme rather than one particular event because it goes for multiple fighters, and it's what if some of these all-time great fighters like Daniel Cormier, Alex Pereira, Yoel Romero, and Brock Lesnar started MMA earlier. Guys like Daniel Cormier and Yoel Romero were too focused on Olympic wrestling, so they didn't get to MMA and the UFC until their 30s. Guys like Alex Pereira also didn't get to the UFC until their 30s because he was too busy kickboxing. And it just makes my mind wonder, what if they went straight into MMA at 18 years old? Would these guys have been the greatest fighter of all time? I especially think this for guys like Yoel Romero because he came to the UFC so late and was pretty much just an athletic freak with power who also had great wrestling skills. If we could have seen a prime 29-year-old Yoel Romero at middleweight, I feel like he could have beat guys like Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya. But this is a what-if that I think is slowly going to go away as MMA becomes a bigger sport and more people start it at a younger age. I think we're going to see less transitions from other sports because MMA is just going to become too high level for you to transition later in life. Regardless, all these boxers, kickboxers, Olympic wrestlers who transition to the sport late are the biggest what-ifs in UFC history, along with the guys who just never even came over to MMA, guys like Gordon Ryan and Jordan Burroughs. I would have loved to see them compete in the UFC, and I hope more guys like that do compete in the UFC in the future. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if I missed anything, and thank you for watching.